Right, so the streaming has just already started, right?
Okay, great. So let's start. Hi everyone, welcome you all. Now we are pleased to have Alexander Proust talk, which has the following title: An Alternative to the Privational Theory of Evil. I want to underline that Alexander Proust is the director of graduate studies for the Baylor Philosophy Department, and he has taught various courses, including the graduate seminars on philosophy of time, metaphysics, the cosmological and ontological arguments for the existence of God, modality, free will, and the history of philosophy. And Alexander Proust has several interesting books like this one, this book about the principle of sufficient reason. This is an amazing book uh, uh, as defense of the principle of sufficient reason. Um, but today, Alexander Proust will talk about the problem of evil, namely for an alternative to the privational theory of evil. So, Alexander, you can start your talk. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, all of you, for organizing this, and thank you for listeners. So here's an argument that kept a very smart person, St. Augustine, from believing in monotheism for a while. First, God is perfectly good. Second, everything that exists is either God or is created and sustained by God. 3, a perfectly good being is not an evil. Nothing created and sustained by a perfectly good being is an evil. Well, so what have we got, right? Everything is either God or created by God. God isn't evil, an evil. Things created by God aren't evils. So 5, there are no evils. No evil exists. 6, existence thesis. An evil exists, right? We just can point to them, it seems like. Some are really minor, like when I was bitten by a mosquito last night, and some are really major, like the Holocaust. Easy to point them out, so we get a contradiction. So for a while, Augustine was attracted to the Manichaean solution, which is to deny the second premise that everything that exists is either God or is created and sustained by God, because there's a second, there's like 2 more options. It could be the evil God. In addition to the God who is good, there is an evil God, and that one is probably not created. And then there will be some things created by the evil God, namely evils. So we get out of the argument by denying premise 2. In the end, Augustine was not satisfied by the Manichaean solution. We can talk, if we're interested, we could talk about what weaknesses it has, but he eventually went for Orthodox Christianity. And what he did is he denied premise 6, which seems like so obvious that an evil exists. Now, if he just stopped there by denying the existence thesis, you could have some kind of highly optimistic view or something of the world. But that would be crazy. So what he did instead is he denied it, but said, yes, there really are no evils. The true metaphysics of the world doesn't include evils, but wherever we ordinarily say there's an evil, what's happening is there's a good that is lacking. There's a lack of a good, and not just a lack, there's a privation of a good, where privation is a lack of something that should be there. And so he concluded that evils are just privations of good, and they don't really exist. They're more like holes which don't exist. I read Augustine's Confessions when I was like around 17 years old, and I found this argument completely convincing, I found it completely convincing that the solution to the problem was to embrace the privation theory of evil, and that therefore any monotheist should accept the privation theory of evil. And I knew there were some difficulties with the theory, but I didn't have any alternative to it, and it seemed like that's the only way out of the metaphysical argument from evil that we've got here. This is different from the kinds of arguments from evil that contemporary philosophers are often worried about. They're worried about evidential arguments from evil, things having to do with evil and whether God has good reason to allow them. This is not about God's reasons. This is about the metaphysics. Where does evil come from? Well, it's either got to be God if God exists, or it's got to be made by God, and neither is, and both are problems. So I, for a long, long time, thought this has got to be right. And then recently I started thinking, I've always known there are difficulties for the privation theory, and they're really bad if you think about it. So I'm going to give you some particularly bad problems for it. But it's not, there is fortunately a different way out of the argument than Augustine's. It still involves denying premise 6, the existence thesis, that an evil exists. I'm going to deny that, but I will have a different theory. But before that, let me say a little bit about the two versions of the privation theory and why the second one is better than the first one. Then I will give arguments against it, and then I will go on to say how some ideas in contemporary metaphysics give a different way out than Augustine's. So simple privation theory is maybe what I call identity theory. Identity theory just says, what is an evil? It is identical with a lack of a due good, a good that should be there. The due part is very difficult to explain, but I'm not going to focus on that. I'm not going to worry about that at all in this talk. So the idea is something like, if a bird doesn't have wings, that's an evil. But if I don't have wings, that's not an evil, because wings are due to a bird, but not due to a human. This theory works very well for certain kinds of things. If I don't do a required safety check before some hazardous activity, what's my evil? It's omitting the safety check. If I sleep in and show up to class late, what's my evil? Not being awake. Easy. But what about some more complicated things? You can get sort of some kinds of privations. A murder causes a lack of life, and it's partly constituted by not having the right to kill. Right? So maybe not all killing is murder, but killing where you lack a right to kill is murder. Theft is partly grounded in a lack of rightful possession, and adultery is at least motivated by a lack of fidelity. Yeah, that's true, but think about it this way. Look, the identity theory would say that an evil is identical to the lack of a due good. That would mean that if a murder is an evil, then a murder is a lack of due good. Like some murders might be lacks, like if parents don't feed their children and their children die and they don't feed them in order to kill them, maybe the murder is a lack of feeding. But a typical case of murder has all sorts of parts to it that are not lacks, like the pulling of a trigger. The pulling of a trigger is not a part of a lack or a privation. So murder and theft typically are not lacks, and adultery is never a lack. I mean, adultery is something that people actually do. It's not an omission. So the identity theory fails for wrongful commissions, for things that are done but are wrongful. Well, there is a way out, and I thought I was very clever when I first noticed this. I had the problem for the identity theory, and then I read, oh, Aquinas knew this too. Of course he did. So Aquinas says in De Malo that there's like two ways of understanding the word evil. In one sense, it can refer to the thing, the subject of evil, the thing that is evil. So in the case of murder, the act of murder is evil. But then there's a second way, which is to refer to what he calls the evil itself. And I think what he means by the evil itself, it's that aspect of the thing because of which it is an evil. So maybe in a wrongful shooting, there is an act, like a pulling of a trigger with certain intentions. That thing is not an evil, or is not the evil itself. That is the subject of evil. It is evil, using evil as an adjective, but is not an evil, using evil as a noun. It's not the evil itself. We may wonder a little bit about details of this, but it at least makes sense of the idea that the act itself is not a privation. It's an actual positive act, a pulling of a trigger, say. But what makes it evil is that it has kind of a missing component, a privation in it. Namely, maybe in the case of a killing, what's missing is the right to kill. Or maybe what's missing is the life afterwards. So this gives rise to what I call evil maker privation theory. And evil maker is my term for that which makes something be evil. That component, aspect, feature of it that makes it be evil. And so the idea is that an evil occurs precisely by virtue of lacking a due good. That's, I think, Aquinas' little sharpening up of Augustine's theory. And now we don't have to worry about murder and theft and adultery immediately. But I think we still have problems. So I'm going to look at 3 problems for this. And they all stem from the fact that the evil maker privation theorist is committed to what I call the lacking thesis. Namely, they're committed to this idea that whenever an evil occurs, that evil occurs because some entity X is missing. And if that entity X existed, it wouldn't be an evil anymore. So the evil maker is the lacking, emptiness, privation of some entity X. And the puzzles, I think, that come, the difficulty for the evil maker theory, and there are also difficulties for the identity theory, but the identity theory is pretty bad anyway. But the problem is that I cannot identify what this X would be. So the challenge in any case of evil for somebody defending the evil maker privation theory is to identify what this entity X that is missing is. And it has to be a real entity, because this is a serious metaphysical theory. It says that an evil is the lack of some entity, something that exists, that could have existed here. And I'm going to argue that in many cases, it doesn't seem like at all possible to identify what this X is. So let's get on to that. First case. This is going to be kind of complicated case. Error, namely false belief, is an evil. False belief is not the same as ignorance. There's lots of stuff I don't know, but I know that I don't know those things. I don't know if there's any life in the universe outside of Earth. That's not error. I'm not in error about that. Whether there is life outside of Earth or not, I'm not in error about that because I have no belief about it. On the other hand, I do believe that the universe is about 12 billion years old. If it turns out to be 10,000 years old, that's not mere ignorance, that's positive error. So error is not just mere ignorance. Mere ignorance would be a lack, but mere ignorance is not actually an evil, because it's not a lack of a due good, because not everything is such that I ought to know it. Error, on the other hand, is like I stick my neck out. I believe something and it isn't true. If I believe it, it should be true. There's something missing. Well, there's something wrong, but what is missing? Well, in some cases, it's easy to identify what's missing. So let's say I have the belief that there are unicorns. If I have the belief that there are unicorns, it's easy to say why my belief is an evil. There's something missing. What is it? It's unicorns. If there were unicorns, my belief wouldn't be false. So my X The X I'm looking for is unicorns. Okay, very easy. All right, I've handled one case of error. But what about error on the other side? Suppose I have the belief that there are no giraffes. My belief is mistaken. But what entity verifies the lacking thesis? What is missing? Well, here's something you could try. What's missing is the absence of giraffes. So it's my belief that there are no giraffes is an evil because there is no absence of giraffes. That seems silly. It makes X be the absence of giraffes, but more seriously, there is no way for Augustine and Aquinas to accept this kind of story, because as soon as you've admitted that the absence of giraffes is something that exists, then you're saying that non-existences exist. And then privations are going to exist because privations are just another kind of non-existence. And if privations exist, then we've got the existence thesis in the metaphysical argument from evil. There are evils because privations really do exist on this view. And now the evil makers and the evils exist, and we have no solution to the metaphysical problem of evil. So that won't work. Not just because it's silly, but because to talk of lacks of absences, but because it just undercuts the whole point of the theory. I want to explore a second option, which I think is probably what Aquinas would go for in this case, which is to say that truth is missing. But now we have to take this very seriously. As ontology, truth here has to be an entity, because what we're talking about, the theory, is that there's some entity that is missing. Some entity that if it existed, there wouldn't be an evil. So the truth here has to be an entity. So let's think about how this a little more precisely, or at least add letters which makes things look more precise. So I have a belief B, suppose, that there are no giraffes. This belief is evil. Why? Because it lacks truth. In a world W1, or actually I call it later W no giraffes. In a world W no giraffes, without giraffes, my belief does have truth. So this entity that is missing is some entity, I'll call it T sub B or X, that exists in the world without giraffes, but is missing in our world. It's this truth of B. What is this truth of B entity? It's not just the Platonic abstract property of truth, because Platonic entities are said to be necessary beings. So if they exist in one world, they exist in all of them. Truth, right? Just truth abstractly speaking, if Platonism is true, it exists in every world. And if Platonism isn't true, it doesn't exist in anywhere. So it's not just truth in general. Truth in general is not missing. There are lots of things that are true. And even if there weren't, the abstract property would still exist if Platonism is true. Instead, what's missing is the token property of truth. Not truth in general, but the truth of this belief B. Kind of token truth, maybe a state of truth, a trope of truth, an accident of truth. The details will depend on what is the right metaphysics. But it's some kind of token, a particular instance of truth is missing. This truth is missing. What is this entity, this truth? It's a kind of relational entity. For example, the truth of my belief that there are horses depends on horses. It's related to horses. So some kind of relation. It exists in this W no giraffes world. There, it's a token relation between a belief B, a belief that there are no giraffes, and what? Well, that's already a little bit difficult. It's a relational thing. It's a relation between what? A belief B and the lack of giraffes? How can you be related to a non-existence? Maybe it's related to the world? It's a little strange and difficult too, but maybe that's the best story. So we have two little difficulties. One, we have to give the story that what's missing in my error is is a token of truth, you have to believe in token relations. So you can't just be a plain Platonist, say, or nominalist, or like a full-blown nominalist. And secondly, they've got like weird relata, like the world or the lack of giraffes. There's, I think, a more serious problem. Let's think about time. And let's switch to a different belief than giraffes, one that has to do with time. So let's say that today you have the correct belief that tomorrow I will eat breakfast. Okay, so now B is my belief that tomorrow I will eat breakfast. Supposedly, we've got this theory now on which true beliefs are true because they have some entity called their truth exists. So now if this entity exists, we can ask, when does it exist? When does this truth of my belief exist? Well, it seems to me there are only two plausible hypotheses. It either exists at the time of my belief, namely or your belief, namely today, right now, or it exists at the time of what the belief is about, namely tomorrow, right? So the truth of the belief that I will eat breakfast tomorrow either exists today or tomorrow. There doesn't seem to be another option. Suppose it exists today. Oh, that doesn't work, because that means tomorrow morning I get up and I eat breakfast, and I made some entity exist a day earlier, right? This entity exists today, but it exists because tomorrow I eat breakfast. So somehow tomorrow I do like some kind of backwards causation, like I backwardly cause the truth of that belief to have existed yesterday. How can I cause something to have existed? Maybe it's not metaphysically impossible in general to have backwards causation, but everybody, I think, agrees that if, maybe time travel, maybe it's logically possible, I don't know. But even if it's logically possible, it's not like something that routinely happens. But we routinely make people's beliefs come true. People's beliefs about what we were going to do. That's just a routine thing. There's no miracle there. There's no like special technology. We do this all the time. But if there is such a thing as backwards causation, it shouldn't be this easy. This seems really paradoxical. So I don't think we want to say that the truth of the belief exists when the belief does. Okay. So the other option is it exists at the time that the belief is about. Okay. That one I think actually may work for the example I gave. So then your belief that tomorrow I will have breakfast is true because it has a truth that exists tomorrow. Well, let's give a different example now. Suppose today you believe that I had lunch yesterday. Then on this theory, that the truth of a belief exists when the object of belief does, the truth of your belief about my lunch existed yesterday. Now, the truth of a belief can only exist when the belief exists. So today, by believing that I had lunch yesterday, and you should believe this because I did, and I'm telling you, so on my testimony, you should believe this. Because of your believing that I had lunch yesterday, you caused the truth of your lunch belief to exist yesterday. So again, we have backwards causation. Previously, it was by eating breakfast that I make truths to have existed. Now it's by believing things you make the truths of the beliefs exist. Because after all, a belief was supposed to be a relational entity between a belief and its object. And you can't have a relational entity without the relata. So by believing, you caused the truth of the belief. Oh, that's terrible. So that doesn't work. Now, this may all seem kind of silly, like we all, do we really take the truth of a belief that seriously as an entity? And so we have to assign a time when the truth exists? Probably not. I don't think in the true ontology we should be that serious about this. But I think it's essential to the privation theory of evil that if error is the privation of truth, then truth had better be a real kind of thing. Otherwise, there's nothing to be deprived of. Let's go on a little bit. Here's another variant. Maybe you could say this. Well, maybe it's not the truth of beliefs, but the truth of propositions. And propositions are Platonic necessary beings. And so there are token relations of truth between propositions and reality. So my false belief that there are no giraffes is made evil by the lack of a token relation between a proposition that there are no giraffes and reality. There are some problems here. One of them is that the lack of a token, that lack of a token isn't evil. It's not evil for a proposition to be false. There are always infinitely many false propositions, no matter what. I mean, for any proposition, either it or its negation is false, I think, though some people dispute that. But even those who dispute it agree that in infinitely many cases, it's the case that either one of the two is false. So yeah, I mean, do we really want to say there are always necessarily infinitely many evils? Okay, maybe you could say then it's an evil maker, but it's not itself an evil. I don't know, that's weird. But some more problems. When do these propositional token truths exist, even if they're truths of propositions? Well, there again, we have two options, I think. One is they exist eternally like propositions, or they exist in time where their objects do. If they exist eternally and timelessly like propositions, then somehow we routinely have the power to make timeless entities exist. That seems almost as bad as backwards causation. What if they exist when the object of the entity exists? Again, we get puzzles about backwards causation. So here's my last example for this. Consider the proposition in B that I had breakfast yesterday and today. If the truth of a proposition exists when the stuff that it's about exists, and that truth exists yesterday and today. So by eating breakfast today, I made something to have existed yesterday, because I made that proposition that I ate breakfast yesterday and today true by eating breakfast today, having already eaten breakfast the day before. So whatever we do, it seems like we either have to make things that exist outside of time exist, or we can make things that are in the past exist. This is very strange. I don't think we should believe in these token truths. More stuff. Pain. What about pain? This is actually a classic problem for privation theories of evil. According to the lacking thesis, if I have an evil pain, there's some entity X that's lacking. What is it? Here's one possibility. I think actually it's not completely a crazy possibility. It's just, I just don't think we have much reason to think it's true apart from trying to save the privation theory. It's something like this. We don't know what pain is. Like, maybe the true theory of pain makes pain be constituted as a lack of something in the brain. I don't know why, but think of like the letter O. It's constituted by a hole in the middle of it. Maybe pain is constituted by a lack of something. I mean, you do things on a computer, right? So sometimes information is constituted by a lack of electricity. That's a 0. So maybe pain is caused by lack of some electrical charge in a neuron. It seems unlikely that it would be just a lack. It seems more likely there would be lack in a presence or something. But maybe it's just a lack. That's a possibility. It just doesn't seem like a super likely one. Another kind of option is you might say, maybe a pain is only sometimes an evil, and it's only an evil when it's kind of either mismatches your desires, so you don't want to have pain, or it mismatches reality. So you might say maybe pain isn't actually normally an evil because it informs you about reality. Well, not all pain does. Some pain misinforms you. Like if you're missing a leg and you still feel pain in it, that's clearly an evil. That doesn't like inform you about reality. It misinforms you. So maybe pain is only evil when it mismatches desire or reality, and then X, this missing thing, is a token match relation. Those are going to, I think, have the same kinds of problems that token truths do. You're going to have problems with, if you believe in token matches, it's going to be a problem. And I think both of these kinds of theories put a pretty heavy epistemic load on the theist. They have to believe in like pretty strange theories to accept the privation theory of evil, or they have to believe pretty strange things about pain. What about sins, wrongdoings? Well, some work pretty well. Lying. What makes lying wrong? The lack of a corresponding belief. Good, lack of a belief. What makes theft wrong? The evil maker is maybe the lack of authority over a thing. It's a little bit less clear because I don't know if authority is a thing, is an entity, but maybe it is. Attempted murder, maybe it's again a kind of lack of authority over someone's life. Adultery, maybe a lack of a token marriage relationship, maybe. But all of this really requires an ontology that includes such things as beliefs, token authorizations, token marriages, a very rich kind of ontology. Some of those you might believe. I personally am okay with beliefs and marriages, but authorizations, I have a hard time believing. But it's at least problematic. So I think we've got problems here. It's hard to fit. It's hard to take seriously this idea of a lack of a real entity and then think through what this entity would have to be in a number of examples. I want to take a different route. And to that, I'll do a detour. Let me do a little bit of something that will be review for some of for some of the people in the room who are more into analytic metaphysics. But before that, let me talk a little bit about what's going on. So it seems like to defend the lacking thesis, we need what people call an abundant ontology, an ontology of lots of things like authorizations, matches, tokens of truth. And this is actually an odd ontology. It's like these things are not material objects. They're contingent, so they're not Platonic entities, but they're also not like concrete things like souls. They're strange kinds of things. Some of these things have problematic relations with time. And it seems pretty unlikely that the truth of the kind of ontology we want is going to allow for solving all of the problems. I mean, for each one of these cases, error, pain, theft, attempted murder, adultery, for each of those kinds of things, we had to find some kind of a theory to make it work. And it felt like very much a strain. It started to feel like we're having epicycles or something. I think there is an ontology on which you can defend the existence of all of these things. And that's Amy Thomason's deflationary ontology, on which basically anything that you say is in ordinary language exists. And we say there is a hole, so there are holes. There is a shadow, there are shadows. There is an authorization from the king, so there are authorizations. Unfortunately, Amy Thomason's deflationary ontology would also make privations exist, because we say there is a privation. And that completely undercuts the privation response to the metaphysical argument from evil, which is that these things don't exist, so we don't need to have God create them. So unfortunately, the best ontology we have that makes this theory work is one that's incompatible with another part of the theory, which is namely the purpose of the theory. Fortunately, there's another way. And now, sorry, at this point, I will do a little detour on something that seems completely different. Here are three intuitions. When I've got a bunch of cells of oak joined together organically into a kind of whole, there is something that's made of them, an oak tree. When I have a bunch of pieces of paper sewn together, and maybe I add some more detail about it, I have something that's made of them, a book. On the other hand, my left hand, my nose, and my right ear, there's nothing that's made of just those three things. Now, these three things are all parts of me, but there's nothing that's made just of this, this, and this. It would be a very strange object. I don't think there is such a thing. Okay, I'm just reporting intuitions here. In the end, we might reject some of these intuitions. I happen to reject one of the three intuitions. Some people reject others. So Van Inwagen, in light of intuitions like this, raises this special composition question. He asks, under what condition does a plurality of X's, entities, make up or compose a whole? And we get three kinds of general answers in analytic metaphysics. One is universalism, which says always. Whenever you've got a plurality of things, they make up a whole. Second, restricted composition. Restricted composition says sometimes but not always. And nihilism says, never. There are no wholes made of more than one part. The nihilist does not believe in a plurality. I'm just going to use, for simplicity, plurality to mean two or more. So the nihilist does not believe that ever a plurality makes up a whole. It's easy to say, here's some kind of really counterintuitive things about it. Nihilists. Many nihilists say they don't exist because how could I exist? It seems like I've got all, if there are all these parts don't make up a whole, so I don't exist. They're just the parts. In fact, not the hands, they're particles. Nihilists will say there are no books, there are no oak trees, and pretty much nothing that common sense believes in exists on nihilism. Okay, so nihilism is hard, but some people believe it. I'm actually kind of inclined to nihilism, but a nihilism of an Aristotelian sort in which I still get to say that I exist, but that's a different story. Against universalism. Universalism is a very popular view, actually, in analytic metaphysics, but it has some problems. One, it immediately violates the third intuition. There's nothing made of my left hand, my nose, and my right ear, because there is, because universalism says that every plurality makes up a whole. Maybe that's not so bad. But there's also another problem, a sort of big problem in the literature for this, that if you think about me, I'm made up of atoms, right? And maybe if dualism is true, a soul. For each one of my atoms, there's a being that's just like me, but's missing that atom, according to universalists, because every bunch of things, every plurality of things makes up a whole. So look at all my particles, except the atom on the tip of my nose. That's a plurality of things, so that makes up a whole. That whole looks just like me, behaves just like me. And in fact, there are tons of these beings just like me, but plus or minus an atom, more than 10 to the 27 such beings sitting in this very armchair, all emitting sounds that are being transmitted over Zoom, according to universalism. That seems, that's counterintuitive, but it's worse than counterintuitive. Peter Unger gives this gave this famous argument that said, look, if we have these infinite, well, not infinitely, but this very large finite number of things sitting in the armchair, it's completely arbitrary to identify one of them as me. They all have an equally good claim to be a person. They can't all be persons. I mean, you know, we know how many people there are in the world. It's about 8 billion. That's a lot, but it's not 10 to the 27. There just aren't that many people. So I can't be, and certainly they can't all be me. That would be just a contradiction. That would be two things. So it would be arbitrary to make me be just one of them. It's really weird to say they're all persons. So we really can't go for this view. So Peter Unger concluded from this that I don't exist, because it would be arbitrary which of these clouds of particles is me. I don't want to go there. I don't want to say I don't exist. I'm with Descartes. I think that's like that's one of the few things I'm really certain of, is that I exist. So I go from, I like Unger's argument, and I take it to be a reductio of universalism. So universalism, I think, though it's kind of attractive and elegant, I think in the end it's unacceptable. So I'm going to dismiss it. Let me talk about some restricted composition theories, and then we'll go back to evil. Here are 4 of them. A plurality of X's makes up a whole, if and only if. Here are 4 options. Organicism, they are engaged in a life. So in this view, the only complete things, only wholes that have parts, wholes WH, are organisms, living things. Trenton Merrick says, things that have non-reducible causal powers. There's like, he thinks persons do. We have special causal powers that don't reduce to those of our parts. Those make up a whole, he says. Marcosian, Brutism. It's just, there is no theory. It just, some things make up a whole, some do not, and that's just how it is. Hylomorphism, Aristotle's, things that have a form, that unite them. That's the one I like most. These are all sparse ontologies. They all have a lot fewer things in them than universalism. So they don't have that many things in them. And now I'm going to give a response to the metaphysical problem of evil. It's going to work on many sparse ontologies like these ones, like a number of these, but I'm going to take organicism as my main example. Everything I'm going to say from now on, nihilism would work even just as well or maybe even better for me. But nihilism is too counterintuitive for me to want to base myself on. So I'm going to use organicism as my main example. And I'm going to marry it to another theory in ontology, which is radical nominalism, or what people call austere nominalism. Radical nominalism holds that the only things that exist are substances. There are no properties, there are no relations, there are no tropes. There are only substances. Things like, people, organisms, other organisms, maybe particles. I don't know exactly what the substances are, but not properties, relations, tropes, and the like. So we've got radical nominalism, and I'm going to add to that Peter van Inwagen's organicism. So I combine these two theories, and I have this ontology. The only things that exist are simple substances. Simple here means have no parts other than themselves. Simple substances and organisms. Two kinds of things in existence. Simple substances and organisms. That's not van Inwagen's own theory because he's not a nominalist. It combines his organicism with nominalism. Suppose we do this. We go for this combination of nominalism plus organicism. Well, here's some plausible things. No organism is an evil. Some organisms are evil, but they are not an evil. Hitler was evil. He was wicked, but he wasn't an evil. Maybe we could say it as not an evil maker. Though in another sense, of course, he made lots of evils happen, but not in the ontological sense. The most obvious simple substances are particles. Those aren't evils. Though there may also be other simple persons like God and angels, but God and angels, I think, would be like us. Some of them may be evil, like some angels might be evil, like demons, but they are not an evil. So I think on this theory, it really is looking like in this ontology, where the only things that exist are simple substances and organisms, some of them are evil, but none of them is an evil. So we can deny the existence thesis. We can say there are no evils. There are things that have the property of being evil, but no thing is an evil. There are no errors on this theory or truths. There are people who are in error and there are people who are in truth. There are no pains or pleasures. There are people who are in pain or pleasure or enjoying pleasure, but there are no such things as pains or pleasures. There are no sins or even virtues. Or there may be substances with all of these things. But a substance is not an evil. So in austere nominalism, we're out of the existence thesis. The only things that if God is creating all the things that exist other than himself, all he needs to create are the substances, because that's all there is. The substances are either simple or organisms. None of those is an evil. So God is off the hook. He doesn't create any evil. And we are out of Augustine's metaphysical problem of evil. Of course, we still have like all this modern problem of evil questions, or the moral problem of evil things like, why are so many of the substances evil? They're not an evil, but they are evil. Why is Hitler such a horrible person? All that remains. But that's not a question for the metaphysical problem of evil. On this kind of austere nominalist organicism, I think we should think of evil as a misarrangement, as a poor way for substances to be arranged. A person is in error provided that what they believe does not match reality. That doesn't require there to be any ontology of matches. It just means that what they believe does not match reality. A person is in pain if they are arranged pain-wise. A person sins provided their behavior is mismatched to fundamental ethical truths or their grounds. There may be some difficulties with making nominal sense of these stories, but they're no bigger than standard difficulties for radical nominalism. So evil could be thought as a but there are no evils because there really are no arrangements or misarrangements on this ontology. They're just the things that are being arranged, persons and other substances. It will be a heavy burden for a theist to be committed to this radical nominalism and organicism. These are both very controversial theories. Fortunately, other sparse theories will do. We don't have to go all the way. We could have a restricted composition theory, but that doesn't go all the way with Van Inwagen. We have some other restrictions in composition than Van Inwagen's. So here's the final story here is something like, here's what we can do to get out of the metaphysical problem of evil. We say we have a restriction on composition that's big enough, that's restricted enough to deny the existence thesis, plus a claim that ordinary language claims about the existence of evil, when they are true because reality is misarranged. Let me go through a few examples and then stop. The evil of erroneously believing that there are no elephants consists in two things. One, the belief, and B, the world's elephants. But it's implausible that there is a thing, which is the combination of the belief with the elephants. There'll be kind of cross-category composition of a state or a trope with a bunch of substances. I think it's a very reasonable restriction on composition that doesn't happen. What about pains? I think it could very easily turn out that pains are not fundamental entities, but the person is in pain just in case there's a plurality of fundamental states. And we don't have to suppose that these fundamental states compose the whole. Pretty much every materialist thinks this. I'm not a materialist, but it seems to me that even a dualist can think this. The evil of attempted murder consists in an attempted killing and various facts in virtue of which there's no authority. I don't have to think there is a strange entity that is composed of the attempted killing plus these various facts that make there be no authority. So we could even have a kind of partial universalism. We could have unrestricted composition of material objects or substances as long as we deny a composition of states or tropes, or at least certain kinds of compositions of states and tropes. And I tried some specific ways here, but we don't need the details here. So conclusions. On the misarrangement theory, every evil is a misarrangement. This misarrangement is not an entity. Due to the misarranged things not composing a whole, or due to the misarrangement involving some non-being. This lets us deny the existence thesis in the metaphysical problem of evil. I think, though this is for a subject for another discussion, by double effect, God can intentionally create or sustain each item involved in the misarrangement without intentionally misarranging in reality. And here's something I haven't said yet, which I think is important. If some evils we notice could be explained by the privation theory, some like moral evils which are omissions, those can be explained by the misarrangement theory, because one way for reality to be arranged is it's arranged missing, with something missing from it. That's one way for reality to be arranged. So the privation theory is actually kind of a special case of the misarrangement theory. So our theory is at least as defensible as the privation theory. Anything that privation theory can handle, it can handle, but it can handle many more counterexamples to the privation theory. And you can make it be a theory of what is an evil or a theory of evil makers. It can be either an identity theory or an evil maker theory. Either one will work. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexander. Great talk. Amazing. A great thought. So let's start with discussion. If you have questions, please write question in the chat, or you can raise your hand to make questions, please. I can start with I can start with a clarificatory question if in order to understand better your account. Uh, Your proposal is very interesting, but I want to know what is your main motivation, what is your main argument for radical nominalism? Because it seems a very strange view to say that there is no properties, no relations, and so on. And your view seems to to be implied with that account. So what is your argument for radical nominalism? What is your main motivation to hold that view instead of other views that are not nominalist?
I don't actually believe radical nominalism, so I should have made that clear. This was my example of an initial theory. I don't believe organicism either. I sort of am a kind of analytic Thomist, but I mean, I think the main reason for believing radical nominalism is Occam's razor. It's like a super simple theory. It has as few entities, but of course, Occam's razor has the qualification: you shouldn't believe in entities unless they have some, unless they're necessary for something. And I think in the end, probably the tropes or accidents and forms, as the Aristotelian calls them, are necessary for explaining things. So my preferred version of this theory is going to be one where, yes, we have tropes, but we cannot combine them into a whole. We have got restricted composition of tropes. And so this is what I have at the bottom of this page, which I kind of skipped over. So the idea is that we do have a number of tropes, and sometimes in evil might be made up of a number of them, but the number of tropes do not actually make up a whole. So let's say I have a belief and a desire. Then what do I have? I have a belief and a desire. I don't have a third thing made up of the belief and the desire together. So I could just deny composition of tropes. So this is kind of like nihilism for tropes, which is not as crazy as nihilism altogether. Nihilism altogether is nuts, it seems. But nihilism for tropes, who knows? That seems much more defensible. And nihilism for tropes doesn't mean there are no tropes. It means there are no compositions of tropes.
Yeah. Yeah, I see your point. Yeah. Okay, let's go to the next question. Agnaldo, please go ahead.
I think there's a question in the chat was made before.
Gabriel, do you have a question? Gabriel?
I'm looking in the chat. There is a question in the
Gabriel,
chat.
First
Actually,
question.
2 questions made in the chat.
So the first one is, might it not be the case that my belief that there are no giraffes is only evil because of the absence of some good effect that will follow from the belief that there are no giraffes? I guess I'm just enough of an intellectualist that I think it's a bad thing to be wrong.
Yeah.
And there might not be a good effect that's lacking from my believing there are no giraffes. You might have good effects that I believe there are no giraffes. I could become internet famous and get money out of it in some way. I could monetize the conspiracy theory that giraffes are made up. I don't know. So I guess I just want to say, no, yeah, the belief itself is a bad thing. It's bad to believe falsely. See the other one. can't it also be the case that my belief that I'll have breakfast tomorrow is only evil on the very occasion of the absence of breakfast? Such belief could be neutral until the verification of the absence of the breakfast. Well, that's interesting. Or even being evil due to the absence of causes to provide the effect of having breakfast the next day. That's really interesting. Yeah, I want to think about that. So the suggestion is that there's nothing bad about my belief until tomorrow. And then it's kind of retroactively becomes bad. Like it had been bad. That's, I think, a little bit strange that, because maybe tomorrow I don't have that belief anymore, right? Because today I believe I'll have breakfast tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm hungry and I haven't had breakfast, and now I believe I don't have breakfast. So now let's see how this works. So it's kind of like retroactively becomes, the past belief becomes bad. I don't know. I don't quite know how. There may be some way of defending it, but it's, I think, kind of strange that at the time the belief existed, it wasn't bad, but now that it doesn't exist any longer, it is bad. It might work better with propositions. That might be worth thinking about, because the propositions exist eternally, unlike the beliefs. And maybe you could say the proposition only becomes bad later. Yeah, that's interesting. And I should also note that my arguments did assume a certain kind of theory of the future. If you have an open future view, you won't like that argument.
Yeah, thanks for that. Agnaldo, go ahead.
I've always thought that Augustine's theory of privation was linked to Plato's idea in the Republic that reality comes in degrees, and is linked to the idea of good and beauty and truth, the transcendental ideas. But I didn't see in your criticisms any relation, any mention to the gradualistic theory of reality.
Yeah.
Do you think that would make any difference? And do your criticisms against privation theory would imply anything against the gradualistic theory of reality?
That's a great question. I like something like the gradualistic theory. But maybe I want to say that's not. I think you could probably have the gradualistic theory of the good without having the privation theory of evil. Maybe that's something that would be worth exploring. So I think you could probably I'm hoping you can separate the two. That would be kind of nice. And so Augustine may have two motivations. One is the one I gave, which is the metaphysical problem of evil, and the second one might be to preserve this thing that he learned from Plato, which is very appealing to him. It may be particularly appealing if you think of God as this eternal I am and all reality proceeding from God and all that, which I'm also on board with. But I think you can probably have the gradualist theory about the good without this privation theory of evil. And I think there is actually already initially a bit of a tension between the privation theory of evil and the gradualist theory, because the gradualist theory would kind of suggest that maybe evil is just a lack of good. But Augustine knows he can't just say that. Everybody in the tradition knows they can't just say that, because it's not an evil that I don't have wings. So you have to sort of tweak it. It's more than just a lack. It's a special kind of lack. It's a lack of something that should be there. And then I think it's more than just what you get from the gradualist story.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Jizia, go ahead.
Hi, Professor Bruce. Thank you for
Hi.
your presentation. I was just wondering, what if Augustine was just trying to make an analogy in order to clarify what evil is, instead of really trying to explain evil through some theory of privation, explicit or implicit? Or what if Augustine was just trying to make an analogy instead of trying to explain through some theory, explicitly or implicitly? I'd like to hear from you what you think about it.
I mean, I could say this. He was just trying to, sort of illustrate how things that we talk about as existing, some of them don't really exist because they're privations. And that was just an example of a way for things not to exist. Other ways for things not to exist is because they actually would consist in a bunch of things which don't have a composition. And now Augustine is looking like somebody who just had my theory, but wasn't as clear about it as I am. Now, that seems to me to have, I really don't want to be in the position of saying, Augustine had my theory, but he just wasn't as clear about it as me, because that seems like, I don't know, that seems kind of putting myself above Augustine too much. Yeah, I think he's doing more than that, but it would be interesting. I mean, we'd have to go back to the text. I certainly did not read the text, and I think people don't read the text that way, but there would be a question for Augustine scholars. Can you read those texts as just giving illustrations?
Yes, because I had the impression, I read that argument, that part of Augustine Confessions recently, and I really didn't see so much of a theory, but something like an analogy or an attempt to grasp something about what is evil in face of goods we have. But yes,
I think
I'm just
that's
trying
really
to.
interesting. Yeah, and it would also solve this kind of textual problem, which is that he talks about his stealing of pears, and he's troubled by it, but he's not troubled by the sort of obvious fact that this is not a privation, right? This is like an actual, you take your hand and pluck these fruit from the tree. Like, that's not a lack. You cause a lack maybe or something, and you're motivated by a lack of certain goodnesses, but the act itself is not a lack. It's not a privation.
Yes.
And he never discusses that. So on your interpretation, that would be an explanation of why he doesn't, because he doesn't need to. So that would be nice. I mean, that's not how the tradition afterwards took him. So if Augustine doesn't say this, I'll just say the Augustinian tradition.
Okay, thanks. Interesting.
We have a comment in the chat, a question in the chat on nominalism. How would goodness be explained?
I guess on nominalism, there's no such thing as goodness. There is, but some things are good. Just as there's no such thing as greenness, but some things are green.
Yeah.
Austere nominals, just so we don't explain these things.
Yeah, sure.
And then we've got Ed Braga, who doesn't know how to raise his hand.
Yeah, but you can turn on your mic, please.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, please.
All right. My question is very simple, Professor Proust. I was wondering about what consequences do you think it would follow of your misarrangement theory of evil in discussions of the problem of evil? There are a lot of discussions of the theory of Augustine in this debate, but I wanted to hear from you. What consequences do you think it would have, your misarrangement theory would have in this debate of the problem of evil?
I think it depends on what it is to debate of. If it's the metaphysical problem of evil, then obviously it has an answer to it. But I think a lot of the contemporary problem is driven by this idea that the good God would eliminate all evils unless there's good reason to permit them. And you can formulate it in such a way that sounds like evils exist, but really, I think this problem is kind of neutral on the theory of evil and is just as big a problem given Augustine's theory as misarrangement theory or any other of these metaphysical theories, because it's really just this question, okay, so suppose privation theory is true. Why is it that God allows us to be deprived of so many goods that are due to us? Misarrangement theory. Well, you just ask the question, why is it that God allows reality to be so badly arranged? And I think the contemporary problems just remain no matter which of these metaphysical theories you take. And I don't think the Augustine theory helps. I don't think my theory helps. I could be wrong about this, but I think the problems are more sort of ethical. And epistemological, can we justify a belief that God has reasons in the face of the fact that it seems like for at least a number of evils, we can't figure out the reasons?
Yeah, thanks for that. Now, are there more questions? Okay, last one, Sterling, please.
Hi, thank you for your talk, Professor Press. That was a really interesting take. I was curious, do you think this misarrangement theory would work with dealing with, and the Summa Theologia, when Thomas poses his objection to the existence of God, that if one of two contraries is infinite, but the other cannot be? Maybe in this instance, it would be, you could say that if God is some infinite, and you might have been hinting at this previously, but if there's because one way of thinking of Thomas's example is in the privation model is if there's light and darkness, if one of those were infinite, the other wouldn't exist. But in a more kind of agential way, maybe if there were an infinite enlightener or an infinite darkener, so maybe in this it could be if there were an infinite arranger or an infinite misarranger, how would there be any instances of arrangement or any instances of misarrangement? Do you?
Yeah.
I was curious what you think about that.
I don't know. I mean, I don't see it as clear that an infinite arranger is going to arrange things in such a way that there is no misarrangement. I mean, there's a kind of sense in which the universe as a whole is not going to be misarranged, but parts might be misarranged, because it may well be that arranging one thing well involves arranging another thing badly. Maybe not intentionally. I mean, think of like, you make a pattern, right, out of a bunch of things. By making a pattern that is orderly, maybe you make a pattern that's not complex. I don't know. So, right, so there's like making one kind of pattern that's arranged well in one respect may make that pattern be misarranged in another respect.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. Thank you.
Great. So let's thank again Professor Alexander Prus for this amazing talk. Thanks a lot for that. Now we move for Professor Desiderio Murcho. Hi, Desiderio. Can you share your screen, please?
Hi, certainly.
Yeah, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Yeah, great. So next talk will be presented by Desiderio Murcho with the following title, Learning from Anselm Argument. Desiderio is a Portuguese philosopher, teacher, and writer. He is a professor of philosophy at Federal University of Ouro Preto. Desiderio is the author of more than a dozen books like this one about logic. This is a great book on logic, elementary logic. And in this book about logic, Desiderio also makes some applications to philosophy of religion. We can see some application to the evil problem, to the problem of evil, and to, for example, to Anselm argument, to the ontological argument, and so on. And Desiderio also translated into Portuguese several works of philosophy, including philosophers as Quine, Swinburne, Plantinga, Davison, Blackburn, Thomas Nagel, Singer, Susan Wolf, Bertrand Russell, and so on. And today, Desiderio will talk about the ontological argument, namely the Anselmian version of the ontological argument. Thank you, Desiderio, for your talk, and you can start.
Thank you, Domingos. It's always a pleasure to be again with you, although very far away.
Yeah, really.
And thank you very much. So I hope that you like what I have here for you. Now, I believe that Anselm's argument for the existence of God is, well, fascinating, at least for some of us. And I guess that presumably that's because it has two features that pull in opposite directions, at least for as I read him. On the one hand, it seems incredible that the existence of a being like God could be proved using reason alone. Of course, it's not surprising to prove by reasoning alone that there exists a prime number smaller than 5 and bigger than 2. Other than mathematical abstract entities, however, it seems incredible that one can really prove the existence of something out of thin air, so to speak. The so-called cosmological and design arguments for the existence of God rely on empirical data. Perhaps they are not cogent, but they are not trying to pull a rabbit out of a hat, so to speak. So if they do not fail, if those arguments do not fail, well, that's not surprising. Anselm's argument is quite different. If it does not fail, it is very surprising. It means that God is a very special sort of entity, not unlike mathematical and other abstract entities, in that its very existence is provable by reasoning alone. And that is very surprising. On the other hand, though, it is not easy at all to see where is the mistake in Anselm's reasoning, if it is indeed mistaken. So what I will try to show you is to, well, I will try to present to you a tentative diagnosis of what perhaps is wrong in Anselm's reasoning as, or what it was that he was aiming at. Now, if this diagnosis is right, the mistake has enough generality to be useful as a lesson on how not to reason philosophically from conceptual possibilities. The shocking diagnosis, if not wrong, is that the sort of argument Anselm seems to have in mind is a closet version of a trivial fallacy, appeal to ignorance. It remains to be seen if other versions of the so-called ontological argument make the same mistake, not to mention other philosophical arguments that appeal to conceptual possibilities. Okay, so let's start with Anselm's own words. He writes, if that than which a greater cannot be thought exists only in the understanding, then the very thing than which a greater cannot be thought is something that which a greater can be thought. But that is clearly impossible. Therefore, there is no doubt that something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the understanding and in the reality. So Anselm's first move is to define God as that being greater than which a greater cannot be thought. Now, greatness here, greatness is to be understood as something like excellence. And notice also that the thought is not directly that God is greater than all our other beings. That would send the argument back to the empirical realm, so to speak, just like the cosmological or the design arguments. His idea seems to be rather that the concept of God is such that there is no concept of a greater being. Whatever greater being one can conceive, so great that no greater can even be conceived, that is what Anselm means by God. It is this feature alone that supposedly proves that that being exists, not just that as something that one thinks, but rather as something that exists apart from existing in thought. And that is so because the very hypothesis that the being thus defined does not exist lands one supposedly in contradiction, because in that case, one can easily think of another being, just like the first, except that it exists. However, this supposedly contradicts the first thought because we were explicitly assuming that God is that being greater than which no other can be thought. And we just thought about a being greater than God. Now, one initial worry is that the very concept Anselm has in mind is perhaps impossible. After all, necessarily there is no odd number greater than which no greater odd number can be thought. For any odd number one can think of, there is always a greater one. Now, this is a serious worry, but it fails to present a diagnosis of what, if anything, is wrong in Anselm's reasoning. Maybe Anselm's concept of God is impossible, and maybe not. Even if it is impossible, though, there is presumably something wrong with his subsequent reasoning. And assuming his God is impossible does not explain what it is that is wrong with Anselm's reasoning. Likewise, it is easy to come up with obviously flawed arguments that follow Anselm's pattern. One thinks of that world's government greater than which none can be thought. That's easy enough. Alas, it doesn't exist, and it is doubtful whether it will ever exist. Following the same pattern of Anselm's reasoning, though, we will reach the conclusion that bad government exists. Again, this sort of reaction fails to explain what is wrong with Anselm's reasoning. It tells us only that something is wrong. Nothing serious depends on the issue of what exactly Anselm means by cannot be thought, or what he should have meant. Still, a few clarifications are in order because that will be the heart of our inquiry. The first and obvious thing to say is that it would be uncharitable to claim that Anselm has in mind some narrow psychological understanding of thinking. Some people are, say, logically dim. They cannot think of a trivial logical proof of a given result. This does not mean that that proof cannot be thought by others. So, can be thought is to be understood as some properly knowledgeable and competent agent is capable of thinking it, even if other agents are incapable of doing so. Still, this is problematic. Goldbach's conjecture may well be true as far as we know, and in that case, perhaps there is some way of proving it true. However, the knowledgeable persons in these regards were not able so far to think of a way to prove Goldbach's conjecture. Does that mean that we are unable to think of a proof of Goldbach's conjecture? Well, not exactly. We should draw a distinction between thinking in the most general terms, which means basically that one can put forward some descriptive words to that effect, and thinking with some degree of detail. Presumably, no one is able to think with some degree of detail of a million-sided polygon. But most people can think about it in the most general way, just because they are able to articulate the concept and even say several true things about it. So perhaps Anselm has or should have had something like this in mind. Some agents are at least able to think in the most general terms of a being greater than which none other can be thought, even if they would be hard-pressed to say anything detailed about that being. Now, one further preliminary remark is the use I will make of conceptual possibility. I will use conceptual possibility to cover at least largely what Anselm seems to have in mind here. The thought seems to be that it is conceptually possible that there is a being such that no greater being is conceptually possible. Now, a key difficulty here was already noted. It is not obvious that it is conceptually possible that there is a superlative being just like that. Perhaps for every great being that is conceptually possible, there is another conceptually possible being that is even greater. Anselm may very well be asking us to think of a conceptually impossible being. That is a worry. But let us grant, for the sake of argument, that that being is not conceptually impossible. This will allow us to try and diagnose Anselm's mistake, if indeed it is a mistake. Now, my last preliminary is again relative to conceptual possibilities. I will understand conceptual possibilities here as sharply distinct from metaphysical possibilities. Suppose that the world is such that it is impossible for a thrown dice to change into an orange winged horse once it hits the table. That would be what I call a metaphysical impossibility. The world is such, under that reasonable assumption, that that event is simply impossible. This contrasts sharply with conceptual possibility. That event is conceptually possible in exactly this sense. Our knowledge of the truth conditions of the relevant statement is not enough to know that that event will never happen. Thus, I will understand conceptual possibility in this way. P is conceptually possible if and only if we are unable to know that not P merely on the basis of its truth conditions. So it is not conceptually possible for a dice that does not have exactly 6 sides to have exactly 6 sides, precisely because on the basis of truth conditions alone, we know that the relevant statement is not true. Perhaps there are other sorts of conceptual knowledge, not linked in this way to our knowledge of truth conditions. Still, it seems safe to bet that at the very least there is such a thing as linguistic knowledge, and that this is deeply dependent upon this sort of knowledge of truth conditions. And that is all that is required to have a robust enough concept of conceptual knowledge, and therefore of conceptual possibility. Now, are all conceptual possibilities metaphysically possible? Well, perhaps yes, although there is scarce any non-fallacious proof of that. Or perhaps some conceptual possibilities, like a thrown dice that changes into an orange winged horse once it hits the table, some of those conceptual possibilities are metaphysically impossible. But even if all conceptual possibilities are metaphysically possible, the inference from it is conceptually possible that P to P is therefore metaphysically possible is, to my view, invalid, at least if one understands conceptual possibility as I characterized it above. So I am not assuming that some conceptual possibilities are not metaphysically possible. The point is that I am not also assuming that all conceptual possibilities are metaphysically possible. I suspect that if one assumes this latter unproved and perhaps unprovable hypothesis, then it seems that there is no reason to believe that Anselm's inference is invalid. Okay, so this closes the preliminary bit. Let us then return to Anselm's reasoning. He seems to believe that something like statement 1 is inconsistent with statement 2. And the idea is it is possible that there is something greater than anything else. This would be statement 1. And statement 2, there is no entity greater than anything else. Now, there is no inconsistency between 1 and 2, however. If one uses a simple alethic modal logic built as an extension of classical logic, one cannot see, at least I couldn't see any inconsistency here. However, if one changes Anselm's premise, that does seem to give us the desired contradiction, and that new interpretation is 1a. Instead of 1, we will have 1a, and 1a is, it is possible that there is something that is necessarily greater than anything else. Now, 1a does seem inconsistent with 2. So this interpretation adds the necessity operator to do justice to Anselm's thought that necessarily there is no being greater than God. It does not mean to say only that there is no being greater than God, but rather that it is necessary. The very concept of God is that of a being such that no other being could possibly be greater. Now, under this interpretation, which is still quite close to the text, we have what at first looks like the desired reductio ad absurdum. It seems that 2 is inconsistent with 1a, in which case we would have a neat logical proof that God, as defined by Anselm, exists. So here is a tentative proof. Okay, so I will not bother with the trivial details here, but I will explain a bit the way I'm using the logical symbols here. So I'm using here a simple system of alethic modal logic with logical trees. And I've built that on top of, as an extension of classical logic. So I'm assuming classical logic here. And the usual diamonds and boxes are used here as operators for possibility and necessity, along with the other usual logical symbols. The arrow, I'm using the arrow as material conditional. And the Greek letters, alpha and beta, are used as names of possible worlds, so that alpha dash beta means alpha sees beta, which means that beta is accessible from alpha. And sim is just whenever we are introducing symmetry in the accessibility relation between possible worlds. So I explicitly say, well, let's assume symmetry and see see if you can close the branch. So the prefix Greek letter indices mean that a statement is of that logical form is true at that possible world. Thus, if a statement of the form diamond P is true at alpha, then a statement of the form P is true at some world beta. And that means that world beta will be accessible from alpha. So I write diamond P, for instance, instead of alpha diamond P, just because one always starts from alpha anyway, and it sure is a bit pedantic to say at the actual world is raining, instead of just saying it is raining. Now, the left branch is left open because if you use a very, very cautious version of what is sometimes called Leibniz law, the substitution of identical salva veritate, you will not close the left branch. Now, using that very cautious version of Leibniz law, however, you will be able to prove the necessity of identity. You will be able to prove that if A is B, or if A is identical to B, then necessarily A is B. In turn, if you accept this, you will be able to close the left branch. One will use the identity at the possible world beta, B is A, to turn B is not A into A is not A. And thus you will close the left-hand branch. So assume for the sake of argument that the left branch closes, okay? So I will not discuss that. I want to discuss the crucial fallacy in the right branch. Now, symmetry was used to get from A alpha sees beta to beta sees alpha. This is, the idea here is that since the possible worlds beta is accessible from alpha, assuming symmetry between possible worlds, we get that alpha is also accessible from beta. In this logic tree system, being forced to use symmetry to close a branch means that one is upgrading from the simple K system of model logic to KB, or just B if you uses also reflexivity. So the question is this, is it fallacious to assume symmetry here? Now, we accept Anselm's thought that it is conceptually possible that God is necessarily the greatest. But this means that even if the second modality is metaphysical, the first is merely conceptual. That was not marked on purpose. Had it been marked, the first logical form would read something like diamond C, which C means conceptual possibility. Diamond C means conceptual possibility. So we would write diamond C, there is an X such that for every Y, and so on and so on. So the C index marks conceptual possibility. The necessity operator does not have an index here because even if the box is read as conceptual necessity, it is quite reasonable to accept that conceptual necessity entails metaphysical necessity anyway. So even if conceptual possibility does not entail metaphysical possibility, it's quite okay to accept that conceptual necessity entails metaphysical necessity. Now, let us see if there is a good reason to reject symmetry in dealing with conceptual possibility. Consider any statement of the form possibly, if it's possibly necessary that P then P. In axiomatic modal systems, this is the logical form one adds to K in order to get KB. Now, assuming symmetry, any sentence with this logical form is a logical truth. So here is the proof of that. So I will not bother with that. So this is quite trivial. So consider again Goldbach's conjecture. Now, we do not know whether it is true or not, but it is rather reasonable to accept that perhaps it is necessarily true. Thus, it seems reasonable to assume that it is possible that Goldbach's conjecture is necessarily true. From this, however, as long as one accepts symmetry, one proves that that conjecture is true, since it is obvious that something is wrong with that supposed proof. For otherwise, every unproved mathematical conjecture would be easily proved. Our task is to try and see what is wrong with it. Now, one way to block that attempted proof is to reject that the relation of accessibility between possible worlds is symmetric. However, this is a bit too much. Perhaps metaphysical possibility is symmetric. One does not need to go that far. Rejecting that conceptual possibility symmetric is enough. it is reasonable to accept that if Goldbach's conjecture is possibly necessary, then it is true. The point is that we do not know whether it is possibly necessary precisely because we do not know whether it is true or not. If it is false, then it is not possibly necessary. It is impossible. It will be impossible in that case. So the air of truth when one utters the statement, Goldbach's conjecture is possibly necessary, results from a merely conceptual reading of possibly. Goldbach's conjecture is possible in the sense that we do not know that it is false. We have no proof of that. We also have no proof that it is true. So we just don't know. Reading the possibility operator here as merely conceptual possibility makes sense and allows one to block the attempted proof without going as far as rejecting symmetry across the board. It is just that conceptual possibility is not symmetric, even if metaphysical possibility is symmetric. Thus, we should write, it's conceptually possible that it's necessary that Goldbach's conjecture is true, to explicitly mark the fact that we don't know whether the conjecture is necessarily true, but we accept that it is conceptually possible that it is necessarily true. So there is a general morals here that could be summed up as something like, mind your diamonds. Have you checked to see whether they are merely conceptual possibilities? Now, the point here is that if a given possibility is merely conceptual, reasoning on that basis is bound to be fallacious unless one realizes that that operator's logical job is to block most inferences, not to allow them. Bearing in mind that it's conceptually possible that P is to be understood as it is not conceptually known that not P, makes this obvious. Using K with an index CP to mean that an unspecified agent knows conceptually, that is, a priori or merely linguistically, that P. So it is invalid to conclude that Goldbach's conjecture is this or that just because we don't know conceptually that it is not so. So we seem to have a general moral here. It is not just that conceptual possibility is not symmetric. Not being symmetric is just a special case of a general feature of conceptual possibility. It's utter inferential weakness. This weakness is much more obvious if one translates this fancy philosophical term of art, namely conceptual possibility, into its real content, putting in place the conceptual knowledge operator. Now, it can easily be seen that trying to prove Goldbach's conjecture starting from the conceptual possibility that it is necessarily true is falling flat in a form of the appeal to ignorance fallacy. I do not know conceptually that Goldbach's conjecture is not necessarily true, therefore it is necessarily true, and therefore it's true. The same mistake is at work in other reasoning patterns. For instance, take this reasoning pattern. It is conceptually possible that Goldbach's conjecture is true. However, as it is the case with other mathematical statements, the Goldbach's conjecture is either necessarily true or necessarily not true. Therefore, it is true. So here you have the attempted fallacious proof. Now, note that in this case, we do not even use symmetry. So that's not the mistake here. And there is nothing wrong in the left branch. One just ups the game and gets the T modal system. The mistake is in the right branch. Given that P is conceptually possible, does not allow one to infer that there is a possible world beta in which P is true. Perhaps there is no possible world at which P is true, if P happens to be impossible, even if P is conceptually possible. So as we see, mixing conceptual possibility with metaphysical modality is tricky. allowing the move in the right branch makes it easy to seemingly prove that conceptual possibility entails metaphysical possibility. Here is the proof. A way to see clearly the fallacy in this supposed proof is to unpack the concept of conceptual possibility as I suggested above. Using the operator KC for knowledge on the basis of truth conditions alone, we would rewrite the attempted proof just like this, and now you cannot close the branch because despite using reflexivity to try and close it, because the negation of a knowledge operator does not allow any simplifying inference. So this means that no conclusion regarding P or not P follows from the fact that P is not known, either on the basis of truth conditions alone or some other basis too. Thus, any reasonable logic that includes an operator for conceptual possibility will regard it as an inferential dead end, not as a free inference ticket. Conceptual possibility is mainly a disabling operator, not an enabling one. Its main logical role, as far as I can see, is to disable inferences. This contrasts with conceptual necessity that actually enables inferences. From the conceptual necessity of P, one infers validly that P. But from the mere conceptual possibility that P, or even from the mere conceptual possibility that necessarily P, one does not infer anything relevant at all. And this is so even if we have necessarily P instead of P. So from the conceptual possibility that P, from the conceptual possibility that P is necessary, it does not follow that P is necessary. Again, this is so because the claim that necessarily P is conceptually possible is just the claim that not necessarily P is not conceptually necessary, which in turn is just the epistemic claim that we do not know on a linguistic basis alone that it is not necessary that P. So it seems that we have now a clarifying explanation of what is wrong with Anselm's original insight. So it certainly looks as if the sheer possibility of a necessary existence entails its very existence. And this was perhaps Anselm's main thought. However, this is an illusion. From conceptual possibilities to non-trivial conclusion, the step here will be fallacious. There is no conclusion, no non-trivial conclusion from mere conceptual possibilities. And that's because a conceptual possibility is just the absence of conceptual knowledge. And, well, from the absence of knowledge in general, be it conceptual or not, no non-trivial conclusion seems to follow. So, in conclusion, it seems to me that far from being free inferential tickets to prove the existence of God or anything else, conceptual possibilities are inferential dead ends. Now, I will still need to see whether other versions of Anselm's reasoning, namely some contemporary versions or classical ones, fall prey to the same sorts of what it seems to me a very simple fallacy. But that's still work in progress that I haven't done yet. So thank you very much.
Great talk. Thank you, Desiderio. Now we have the discussion. Please raise your hand in order to make questions, or you can write question in chat in order to make some question. I can start with a clarification and a small commentary. Great talk. Thanks a lot for your insights. your talk remind me Van Wagen argument that all ontological arguments beg the question, are begging the question. So that is very interesting because it seems very related with Peter Van Wagen work. But I want to press some issues and some words that I have regarding your premise one, that is the premise of possibility. You say that you hold that the premise of possibility is only conceptual and not metaphysical. So the possibility in question is only conceptual and not metaphysical. But there are a lot of arguments that try to argue that in premise one, there is a metaphysical possibility, like the Leibniz argument, or the metaphysical possibility of premise one. We have also the Gödel argument for the metaphysical possibility of premise one. And if you want an empirical version for argue for premise one, we have, for example, Alexander Proust's argument for the possibility of premise one, metaphysical possibility of premise one. Alexander Proust's argument is very interesting. So what do you think about that kind of arguments that argue for the metaphysical possibility of premise one?
Well, what is the source of that knowledge? I mean, to say that something is conceptually possible is usually quite easy. I mean, you just show that it's not contradictory and it makes sense and it's plausible and that kind of soft talk. But to say that something is metaphysically possible, well, if it's actually true, then you have an argument there that it's if it's true, then it's metaphysically possible. But to say that something is metaphysically possible, it's quite hard. Now, I do grant that if one can show that the God, the sort of concept Anselm has in mind is metaphysically possible, then the argument goes through. I do believe that that's true. My problem is that I don't see how is it that you can argue for the metaphysical possibility of that sort of being. That's the main point. So if there is any good reason to believe that that sort of being greater than which none other can be thought of is metaphysically possible, then I believe that a very simple argument goes through. But compare this with Goldbach's conjecture. I mean, is there any philosophical argument for the metaphysical possibility that that conjecture is true? Well, would mathematicians bother with that? So, well, I suppose you could say that I've become a bit of a metaphysical skeptical here, in the sense that I don't see that you can easily prove metaphysical possibilities in such a way that you're not confusing not just making a leap of faith from conceptual possibility to metaphysical possibility. So I'm quite skeptical about that. But if you can make that move, then well, that's great for Anselm, I guess.
Yeah.
But well, I'm reading the text carefully, and some very contemporary logician-minded reconstructions of Anselm are not quite close to his text, right? So I'm quite far away from his text. But if you read the text carefully, and it's just, I mean, it's wonderful because it's just a few lines, right? The argument's all there. And it's wonderful. It's
And in the middle of a prayer.
yeah, it's. I mean, I have the greatest admiration for Anselm, a guy that walked from Italy to the north of France just to learn. Well, I wish all my students would do that. So I have a great admiration for Anselm, and perhaps his insight was precisely that. I mean, if you really think about the concept of God, you are driven to the thought that somehow, if you at the same time you raise the hypothesis that that being doesn't exist, you fall into a contradiction, because the very concept of God demands its existence, so to speak. So it's a wonderful insight.
Yeah,
Wonderful insight. But I do think that there's something wrong there, and what's wrong there is this leap from conceptual possibility to metaphysical possibility.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Desider. Let's move on for Giselle. Please turn on your mic.
Hi, Professor Desiderio. Thanks for your talk. I put in the chat an objection to it. Nothing of this seems to me to prove that Anselm's argument is conceptually fallacious. If it doesn't work in KB, it doesn't mean it doesn't work at all, for it could work in, for instance, KJB4 or S5, maybe, as some have tried to show. Could you explain exactly why choosing this system definitely shows that the ontological argument is fallacious? Because there are other possibilities, right?
Yeah,
other systems we could try to
because the way I use those logic trees, they are expandable. Whenever you need symmetry or transitivity or reflexivity, you just plug it in, and you get the other systems, the stronger systems.
Yeah.
See how? Mm-hmm. So if one had a way of closing the branch using transitivity or whatever, so that you go all the way up to S5, you would be able to do it. It's just that you are not able to do that. Even if you plug in transitivity and reflexivity and symmetry or whatever else you want to plug it in, you won't get to close the branch.
Right. Yeah. I would like to see the proof if I have it, but
okay, perhaps we can exchange some emails about that. Okay.
For sure. Thanks.
Okay, great. Let's move on for Alexander, please. Go ahead. Please turn on your mic.
Yeah, so this is really just kind of follow up to your answer to Jacil. So you're suggesting that like mathematicians would not look at philosophical arguments for Goldbach's conjecture against, and I think that's right. But there are other things that they at least, would be somewhat friendly to philosophical arguments for. So for example, philosophical arguments for con-ZFC, the consistency of the set theory, or philosophical arguments for, large cardinal statements, like the existence of an inaccessible cardinal, things like that. That seems like something where I think a lot of mathematicians might say, yeah, okay, maybe those kinds of weird things that are sort of far out there beyond ordinary mathematics, maybe that's where philosophical argument becomes more sensible. And the existence of God, it's more like those things than like Goldbach's conjecture, maybe.
But my point here was that it was not that mathematicians shouldn't or don't listen to philosophers. I hope they do sometimes. It's just that it would be quite odd for you to try to prove some conjecture based on the conceptual possibility that that conjecture is necessarily true. It's just that bit. I mean, it's conceptually possible that a given mathematical unproved conjecture is true. That's what we mean by conceptual possible here, is that as far as we can see, we are not seeing any contradiction here. And of course, if anyone saw a contradiction in that conjecture, the mathematicians themselves would say that's false, and that's solved. That's not a conjecture anymore. So the point is that when you have these unproved mathematical conjectures, they are prima facie true, they seem true, just like Fermat's last theorem, it seemed true, but no one was able to come up with a proof until Andrew Wiles did, right? So the point here is that it would be fallacious to say, well, here is a mathematical conjecture. By their very nature, it's either necessarily true or necessarily false. And it's certainly possibly true, because we are not seeing any contradiction here. So it's conceptually possibly true. And that just follows that it's true if you don't mind your diamonds. So my point is that you should mind your diamonds. You should see that when you say that it's conceptually true, that's different from saying that it's possibly true.
Okay, you can move on before Evandro, please turn on your mic.
Hi, Professor Murcho. Thank you very much for the conference. I put in the chat. I remember about a comment of the Nihilists when they wrote the famous History of Logic that Anselm's argument is the greatest dialectic heresy of all times. May I affirm that they are right?
Well, Evandro, thank you very much for reminding me of that. I don't remember at all reading that. I read that when I was a student, and I certainly will look into it again. What is it that they mean by dialectical heresy? Do they mean that there's something wrong with it, or it was surprising, or?
Yeah, I think they thought that there are something wrong with the argument.
But it's not easy to see what is wrong.
They don't scrutinize it in the test.
I think that's one of the fascinating things about Anselm's original argument, is that it's so short, it seems so obvious, and at the same time, it seems that something is wrong with it, but you just can't, it's very difficult to pinpoint where exactly is the mistake, if indeed there is a mistake. Gaunilo's response to it was standard, right? Gaunilo was very, very smart, and he saw right away that you can use the same pattern to prove whatever you want, the perfect island, right? Or the perfect world government. Now, this sort of challenge is very serious, and the way Anselm responds to that is, well, it's the only way he had to respond to that is to say, well, God is special in that regard. So it's not like a perfect island. It's something special in that regard, which was more or less picked up by Leibniz's version of the ontological argument. So, but the Gaunilo's response, Gaunilo's challenge, doesn't show where is the mistake. It just shows that there must be some mistake here. Otherwise, we would be able to show that there is the perfect world government, or the perfect friends, or the perfect island, or the perfect headache, or whatever you want. So, but it doesn't diagnose, it doesn't present a diagnosis of what is the problem exactly. So that's what I propose here. I propose to see if there is indeed a mistake in Anselm's reasoning. The mistake perhaps is he's confusing conceptual possibilities with metaphysical possibilities. And by the way, let us be clear about this. He's trying to argue with the fool. The fool is the atheist, okay, or the non-theist. And he's trying to argue with the fool, trying to say to him, look, you don't believe that God exists, right? But you certainly can conceive of God. And the other guy says, well, sure, I can conceive of God. I mean, I read about it, and I listen to you speaking about it, and I can conceive of God. So Anselm goes back and says, okay, so But what exactly is that God that you can conceive of? Well, it's a maximally greater being, so big, so great, so excellent that no other being you can conceive of there is. There is no other being, greater being that you can conceive of. So, and that's his main thing about the way he thinks, right? I mean, he thinks he can say to the other guy, well, look, you don't believe that God exists, but you can conceive of God. And now I will show you that if you conceive carefully God, the way I presented it as that being greater than which none other can be conceived, if you conceive of God correctly, then you will see that you fall into a contradiction if you at the same time accept the hypothesis that God doesn't exist. So in this dialectical situation, Anselm is not allowed to ask the other guy, you have to accept that God is a metaphysical possibility. Because the other guy would say, why would I accept that? That's exactly what I don't know. I don't know if God is a metaphysical possibility. Perhaps it's a metaphysical impossibility. I don't know. I listen to you with delight when you talk about God, and it's wonderful, and I love you, dear brother Anselm, but I don't know. But what the other guy is ready to accept is, well, I do accept that God is conceptually possible. Because I see no contradiction in imagining that God exists. That is certainly conceptually possible. And that's the main thing here. I mean, Anselm thinks, I believe, that he may say to the other person, okay, so as long as you think that God is conceptually possible, I can show you that follows that God exists. And that's wonderful, right? I mean, that's if you can do that, that would be really, really exciting. Well, unfortunately, I think that you cannot do that.
Yeah, nice. We have time for more questions. Bertato, do you have some question? You wrote something in chat.
Yes. Thank you very much for this very, very stimulating talk.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Murcho. I just want to know if to know conceptually that P implies that is possibly conceivable P.
I suppose it's the same. Can you repeat that?
KCP implies diamond CP.
Yes.
Yes.
That's exactly it. I mean, the thought is that KCP is just the unpacking. Actually, KC not P is just the unpacking of diamond CP. Okay, by definition. Okay, so let me write it. So okay. KC not P, okay, is the same as diamonds.
Yes. Not K, C, not P.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to say that it is conceptually possible that P is to say that I do not know conceptually that not P.
Okay, but if I know that is P is conceivable,
okay,
this means that this implies that it's possible conceivable P.
Okay, I haven't thought about that yet, because that's very interesting, because what you're doing is that you are plugging together different diamonds, and some of them unpacked as conceptual operators, knowledge conceptual operators, and others with just the diamonds. So that's interesting logically. I haven't thought about that. Thank you very much, Fabio. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, do you have more questions? Are there more questions? Please raise your hand or write question. Yeah, Ricardo, please.
Thank you very much, Desiderio, for your interesting talk. I'm not sure I'm convinced by you that the Anselmo argument is wrong, because I think there is a relationship between concept and reality. that is not explicit in the Anselmo argument, and also is not explicit in your argument, because I don't. Seems to me that you assume a Kantian duality of reality and concepts, and I'm not sure that it's possible, because I think when Anselmo talk about thoughts, they talk about thoughts that there is in reality as they think as well. And the vision that there is two domain that for me, I don't understand the two domains arguments, because how the concepts and the reality are related in the two domains arguments like yours.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. As I said before, if one accepts that everything that's conceptually possible, it's possible, then his argument goes through flawlessly. And there you have it. You have the proof that God exists. So you'll burn in hell if you don't believe in God. Okay, so that goes through. But the point is that it's very hard to prove that being conceptually possible entails that it is possible. And there are many everyday examples in which it seems that's just not true. I mean, it is conceptually possible that I drop my smartphone and it turns into a human being. That just doesn't seem possible. It is conceptually possible, in the sense that when I think about it, I don't see any contradiction here, right? It is conceptually possible. It doesn't seem metaphysically possible. So that's all I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if you have a way of proving the entailments between conceptual possibility and metaphysical possibility, then his argument goes through. If you don't have that, then his argument doesn't go through, and that's the mistake there. The mistake is jumping from conceptual possibility to real possibility, so to speak, metaphysical possibility.
Oh, okay, but I think when he talked about this all-inclusive reality, it includes all your arguments, your thoughts, like a system, like a big system. So there is one reality in this case, not two types of things like concepts and entities that are non-conceptual. Conceptual. You understand? I admire your work, because you try to see in close what happens with the Anselmo's argument that lead us to think that it's possible to from concepts to arrive the existence of God. But I think that there is some property of this object that is not like Thales or something like that, but is the most inclusive reality. I don't know.
But the point is still the same. I mean, even if God is the most inclusive reality, the point is still the same. He's trying to argue the fool into believing that God exists, right? And the fool won't accept that God, even if it is by hypothesis the most inclusive reality, the fool will not say, well, okay, I see that it is metaphysically possible. Well, he doesn't know whether it is metaphysically possible or not. The only thing that the fool will concede is that I see that God, conceived as the most inclusive reality, is conceptually possible. And that's his main way of trying to talk the fool into believing that God exists, because Anselm seems to think that as long as he accepts that God is conceptually possible, then it follows that he will contradict himself if he still says that God doesn't exist in reality. By the way, notice that Anselm himself, of course, he doesn't believe that everything that's conceptually possible is possible, in the sense that he talks about the painter who imagines something in his head and doesn't, and before he paints his painting that he imagined in his head, the painting doesn't exist. It exists only in his imagination. So he does, with this example, Anselm seems to accept that there are conceptually possible things that don't actually exist. Okay, so which is quite obvious, right? I mean, he would be a fool to believe that everything that someone conceives of actually exists. So that's not his point. The point is that, as you were saying, Ricardo, God is such a special sort of being that the sheer possibility of its existence entails that it exists. Okay, so that's the main thought. The difficulty is that you can do that if you accept from the beginning that it is metaphysically possible that God exists. And you are not able, as far as I can see, to do that if you concede only that it is conceptually possible that God exists. And that's the main problem. Thank you, Ricardo, very much. Thank you.
Great. Any more question? I have a last question. I am thinking about a Platingian style to move in order to try to reply to your conclusion. Think, for example, that a Christian have an inch commitment or a proper basic belief that God is metaphysical possible. And if that Christian have an inch commitment or a proper basic belief on God, that God is metaphysical possible, he can ruin the argument to conclusion that God exists. What is the problem with that? With that Platingian style?
Well, if one has either a good reason to believe that God is metaphysically possible, or a sort of a internal strong commitment that is not the sort of thing that you can arrive at by evidence seeking or something like that, that God is metaphysically possible, that the argument goes through.
Yeah.
The problem would be, how do you know if that's a hinge commitment? How do you know whether that's properly basic? And how do you distinguish a hinge commitment from mere stubbornness? And how do you distinguish a basic properly belief that's something that arises in you from the instigations of the Holy Ghost from mere stubbornness again? How do you distinguish those things? So that would be a completely different problem. So I do accept from the beginning, and that's my admiration, I guess, for Anselm. I think that he really uncovered a great argument in the history of philosophy. It's just that you only go through if you accept that God is metaphysically possible. But it's still a great argument.
Yeah, that is true. GZL, do you want to comment something about that?
No, just that Plantinga's point about the ontological argument goes along these lines as well. So just to...
Okay, great.
Thank you, Jaziel. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's thank again Professor Desiderio Murcho for this amazing talk. Great. And thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
And see you again tomorrow. Right?
Yes. Thank you, Domingos. Thank you, Professor Murcho. Bye-bye. See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye. See you tomorrow. See you all.
Thank you. Thank you all for this day. Bye-bye.